Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1302. And today the topic that we'll be covering is that of World War II. Now, just a warning really quick before we get started with this video. I believe it'll be relatively lengthy, so go ahead and sit back for this video. But anyways, we're just going to pick up on themes that we had talked about within the previous lecture, where we saw the rise of Hitler, Imperial Japan, as well as Mussolini around the world. Now, with that said, we do start to see that by 1939, those powers proved to be relatively aggressive. And eventually we saw the outbreak of World War II with the German invasion of Poland. However, the question we have to ask ourselves was, what was America doing in the midst of all of what had just occurred? How was America responding to the rise of Hitler? So we're going to be focusing now on America and their worldview of the rise of Hitler over in Europe, and then ultimately how Americans are going to respond, eventually get involved in World War II, and we'll talk about the conflict itself. Now, during the 1920s and the bulk of the 1930s, we'll see that American thought, at least in regards to foreign policy, is going to be dominated by this idea known as American isolationism. Now, American isolationism, we had seen during the 1920s, was a part of that return to normalcy policy, to where America withdrew from foreign politics. We see mainly with the League of Nations, this is a prime example, to where the U.S., even though it was an American invention, they would not participate in this League of Nations, fearing that perhaps it could get them involved in another European war. And as a result, isolationism would dominate American thought throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. And by the time we see the rise of Hitler, and it looks like perhaps we could be on the verge of another conflict in the near future, in 1935, because of public pressure, we will see that the Roosevelt administration, to solidify this idea to stay out of a European conflict, is going to pass the first in a series of what are called the neutrality laws. Now, the first Neutrality Act that will be established in 1935, it will prohibit the United States from trading with any belligerent nation at war. And as a result, America wouldn't be able to take sides and trade and supply goods to those countries who were at war with one another, and this would hopefully keep America out of the conflict. However, as Hitler becomes more aggressive, as well as other powers, by 1937 we'll see that there will be revisions done to the neutrality laws. Now, America would agree through one provision that if enacted by the president, they would provide products towards certain belligerent powers, but it will be in the 1937 neutrality law where we see the establishment of this provision called cash and carry. While most Americans did not favor getting involved in a conflict, most Americans did favor supplying some goods, at least to their old allies from World War I, that of Great Britain as well as France. And as a part of this cash and carry policy that would be established first in the Neutrality Act of 1937, if enacted, it allowed the president the authority to open up trade with a nation at war if they brought in their own ships into American harbors, brought cash with them, purchased their goods, and transported themselves back to their nation. This would ensure that American ships wouldn't come under threat and eventually lead off to a war. Now, this cash and carry provision, it's going to greatly favor the British because they have one of the mightiest navies in the world, whereas Germany, because of the Treaty of Versailles, had virtually nothing. However, there was another power that America did not want to take advantage of this provision, and it's no surprise why America would never enact this provision and actually put it to function. Out in the Pacific, the Japanese had a mighty empire, and as a result of this policy, they could have taken advantage of it, even though they did not promote American interests. And we'll see that the cash and carry policy provision would never be enacted until a later Neutrality Act. However, in the meantime, even though the U.S. was remaining firmly neutral through these laws, we will see that events over in Europe are going to make it extremely difficult for the U.S. to stay out of war, especially when we see the creation of an Axis alliance between Rome, Berlin, as well as Tokyo, but more notably when we start to see the beginnings of conflict in Europe. Now, with the start of war in September of 1939, we'll see that the U.S. here in a moment will take further steps that will begin to prepare the country for conflict. But anyways, let's turn our attention to what was occurring back over in Europe, because it will prove crucial in the American response to those events. Now, when we last talked about events that were occurring over in Europe, we see on September 1st, 1939, the war begins with the German invasion of Poland. As a result of the German invasion, we'll see in less than about a month, Poland would fall to the Nazis. It would be divided up between them as well as the Soviet Union, and from here, Germany could then turn its attention west, towards France as well as Great Britain. Now, Hitler's not going to immediately attack either Great Britain or France because he knew that they were not an immediate threat to the nation of Germany. The reason for this was because of World War I. Both Great Britain and France, impacted by that event as well as the Great Depression, were in no position to issue an immediate attack against Germany. Their hope was that they could recreate the fighting of World War I. They began to establish trenches all along the German-French border. However, they would come to clash with a new form of warfare that Hitler had implemented within Poland, of what's called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And through Blitzkrieg, Hitler would take advantage of not necessarily a new weapon, but a weapon that had been introduced during World War I, that of the tank, to spearhead attacks, punch holes in the lines of his enemies, and then from there, hopefully take large amounts of land. Now, these two different styles of warfare will come to clash by April of 1940 when we see the Germans launch their long-anticipated invasion of the Western countries. We'll see that the countries of Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, Holland, the Netherlands, as well as Luxembourg and Belgium would fall under Nazi occupation. However, their main target was to occupy France, and we'll see by June of 1940, after desperate fighting, we'll see that France would effectively be occupied. Paris would fall, and Hitler would gain the goal that had long eluded the German Kaiser during World War I, capturing Paris and knocking France out of the war. And when France falls and is occupied, the only power now standing against Hitler and perhaps world domination was Great Britain. Now, Great Britain itself, though, it won't be as easily attacked by Hitler as these other countries that we just mentioned ago. In order for Hitler's panzers, his tanks, to work, he needed to drive them over land. But there's one problem. Great Britain was an island nation, and in order to launch his invasion of Britain, he had to somehow float his troops as well as his tanks across the English Channel. But there's a further problem. He doesn't have a very strong navy, and the mightiest navy in the world was the British Navy at this point. But he does have one area where he has superiority over the British, to where hopefully he could gain enough time to cross his troops across the English Channel and start landing his panzers over in England. Hitler enjoys superiority in regards to his air force. Now, during the 1930s, Nazi Germany had begun to reconstruct its air force, modernize it, and dubbed it the Luftwaffe. And over the course of the next few months, we'll see that the Luftwaffe would try to establish air superiority over the English Channel just long enough to where civilian ships could send over German soldiers to land in Britain. This begins what's known as the Battle of Britain, to where Britain is virtually on the verge of almost collapse. However, against all odds, the British Royal Air Force, even though they're outnumbered on many occasions, they would take advantage of technologies like radar, intercept German pilots, and eventually the Battle of Britain would end in an Allied victory. However, for the time being, we'll see that Great Britain, into 1941, will remain the only power standing up against Hitler. Now, we will see in that year they will gain further allies, but in this time we'll see that Great Britain would continue to be on the verge of collapse, often appealing to the United States to not enter the conflict, at least provide them with some sort of aid to keep them floating. And as we get to the latter portion of 1940 and the beginning of 1941, America was slowly being drawn into this conflict. And so let's see how America was now slowly beginning to shift towards going to war. Now, as we enter the year 1940, America was increasingly being drawn in, or going off towards getting involved in the conflict. In 1939, we'd see that the U.S. would revise its neutrality laws to where it would implement that policy of cash and carry and start behind closed doors beginning to supply, especially with Great Britain, war munitions as well as war supplies. On top of that, what we'd also see is that the U.S., to begin to prepare for war, would begin to shift its economy from producing consumer goods to producing war munitions for that cash and carry policy. And by the end of 1940, about 70% of industrial production would be dedicated to producing war goods. Furthermore, though, Roosevelt wanted to ensure that the United States wasn't ill-prepared for this conflict militarily. We'll see militarily, he would implement what's known as the Selective Training and Service Act, perhaps what could have been one of the more controversial acts passed in American history, because this would effectively create a peacetime draft, the first of which that we see occur in American history. Now, the purpose of the Selective Training and Service Act was to help bolster the size of the U.S. military, to hopefully have, by the end of a decade's worth of time, over about, if I remember correctly, 900,000 soldiers trained who are on the reserves who could get involved in the fighting if the U.S. were to go off to war against Germany. Now, the reason this could have been controversial is not only does it declare a peacetime draft, But we'll see in 1940, Roosevelt was looking out to try to seek re-election. And we'll see that his political opponents, the Republicans, are going to take advantage of this, condemning him, stating that he was trying to get America involved in war. Still a very unpopular opinion. However, Roosevelt in the election of 1940 would assure the American people that he would not send American boys to fight overseas. Hitler was still Europe's problem to Americans. However, even though we do see these attacks made against Roosevelt, he will win re-election in 1940. And why is that so significant? Well, it's because he'll become the first and only president to win a third presidential term. And I want to remind everybody, still at this point in American history, we don't have a constitutional amendment established that limits a president to 2 terms. And we'll see that he'll even go off to win a 4th term during this conflict. But anyways, after he has secured his third presidential term and won re-election, this is where he'll take further steps that will get America involved in the conflict and effectively end American neutrality. Now, what the singular act that will end American neutrality is going to be that of the Lend-Lease Act. Now, the Lend-Lease Act is going to be published in March of 1941, and as I mentioned, it will effectively end American neutrality. Now, how is this going to accomplish this? Well, is what we'll see is the U.S. is going to begin to provide openly aid, war supplies to nations that they deem as crucial for national security. This would include nations like Canada, as well as Great Britain and several other allied states that we see associated with the British Empire. And America had effectively taken the side of the Allied powers. Now, I do want to point out, while the Lend-Lease Act does end American neutrality, this does not mean that America has declared war. They're still not directly involved in the conflict. However, we do see that tensions between the U.S. and Germany will begin to rise, and especially after the passage of the Atlantic Charter that would take place later on in 1941, when the U.S. as well as Great Britain agreed to divide up what the post-war world would look like after the fall of the Nazis. Germany sees America as a threat and begins to target American shipping, and it looks like America could get involved in the war very similar to how they got involved in World War I. However, as many of you probably know, it's not Germany that gets America into the Second World War, but Japan. And it will be in this atmosphere in December of 1941 that Japan would bomb Pearl Harbor. And with it, the U.S. would effectively end World War II. But before I move forward from that point, let's turn our attention out to the Pacific to see why the Japanese are going to bomb Pearl Harbor. So to understand why the Japanese are going to bomb Pearl Harbor, let's understand that what was beginning to develop out in the Pacific prior to December of 1941. Now, prior to this point, as we'd seen in the previous video, Japan was beginning to aggressively expand, to acquire natural resources for their empire. However, even still by 1940, with the territorial acquisitions that they were able to acquire, we will see that they still heavily relied on imports. And not to mention, during this period, as they were beginning to rapidly expand, we do see that there were a great amount of tensions begin to arise between the Japanese as well as the United States. Now, with this said, as we do see that Japan relied heavily on imports, in order for America to stop Japanese expansion, this is where we'll see the U.S. is going to place an embargo on goods that they import into the nation of Japan. They would place an embargo on things like steel, iron, as well as oil to hopefully convince the Japanese economically to stop expanding. However, the Japanese are not going to step down in the face of this embargo. In November of 1941, they would threaten the U.S. to either rescind this embargo or face conflict. Well, the U.S. would reaffirm that they would not step down from their position, and by the end of November, American military thinkers understood at some point there was going to be a Japanese strike, an attack against an American possession. However, many military thinkers believed that initial attack would occur against the American possession in the Philippines. However, they would be completely shocked when the Japanese on December 7th, 1941 would attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed in Pearl Harbor. The reason the Japanese would strike here first is because they understood that the U.S. Pacific Fleet was the key to conquering the Pacific, key to ultimately conquering the Pacific Empire. If they could destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the U.S. could not issue a response for some time, and hopefully this could bring about a quick war to where the U.S. would concede a lot over to Japan. As a result, the Japanese would attack the Pacific Fleet stationed there. Over 2,000 American servicemen would be killed. Numbers of battleships would be both damaged as well as sunk, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet crippled. However, crucial to this, the American carriers that were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor that morning are going to be off at sea. And so those will be crucial, especially in the days to come, because the U.S. will have still a very formidable Navy even after what had occurred at Pearl Harbor. But in the meantime, we'll see that the Japanese will begin to aggressively expand throughout the rest of the Pacific. But in the meantime, when word of this arrives back to the United States, we'll see that Americans were outraged, and the following day, FDR would call on Congress to declare war, which is exactly what will happen. We'll see that the U.S. would formally enter World War II on December 8th after a declaration of war had been agreed upon, and then 2 days later we'd see that the allies to Japan, that of Germany, as well as Italy would declare war on the United States. And America moving forward would be fighting a war on two fronts. And we'll talk both about those here in a moment, but as America enters a conflict, we will see that there will need to be a complete mobilization of not only the U.S. economy, but of American society to support the war effort if they were going to defeat these two massive powers that we see off of either coast. Now, what we'll see is that Congress would begin to authorize a series of acts that would grant the president certain powers, as well as the federal government certain powers to where they could ration out goods, to where they could set prices, and so on and so forth. And during the course of World War II, we'll see that the U.S. economy will become a socialist economy. So that way they could guarantee that all goods being produced towards a war effort would go towards the war effort. On top of that, they also needed to mobilize American public opinion, because it's probably a good idea to have most Americans support the war effort. To do this, we'll see that the U.S. would produce a large amount of propaganda, which I'll post a video that y'all will be watching this week of a piece of propaganda from that period. But nonetheless, we will see that most Americans will come to support the war effort as a result of much of this propaganda, as well as what had occurred at Pearl Harbor. We'll see that the U.S. Armed Forces would begin to swell as hundreds of thousands of volunteers would flock in the days following Pearl Harbor. And eventually we'll see that the U.S. military would expand to over 16 million individuals during the course of this conflict. Now, with that said, as the U.S. economy was beginning to be mobilized, we will see that there will be a great demand for labor, especially when you see 16 million men go over and serve overseas. We'll see that the war would have lingering impacts on several groups. American women would be called upon to support the war effort, take up industrial jobs, and in some cases serve within the U.S. Armed Forces. African Americans would also be called upon to fill in some of these jobs that we see develop as a result of the outbreak of war. We see that there would be another great migration of African Americans northward to take advantage of new opportunities. But even though we'll see America fighting racism and bigotry abroad, this does not mean we'll see all those issues would be curbed back at home. Furthermore, we'll see that other groups, Mexican American groups, Latin American groups, as well as several others would take advantage of the new economic opportunities. However, we will see that there will be a group of Americans whose impact from the conflict would be entirely negative, as they will be forcibly removed from society for the duration of that conflict. And it will be that of Japanese Americans, who would be greatly impacted by the passage of Executive Order 9066 in early 1942. Now, through Executive Order 9066, what this is going to do is force the entire Japanese American community across the United States, almost 100, if I remember correctly, 120 to 130,000 individuals into internment camps. Now, when this happens, we'll see that the U.S. government is going to try to completely hide all of the internment camps, putting them out on the fringes of society. However, we will see that these camps would remain in place for the duration of the conflict. And the reason we see the establishment of these camps was because of the outrage over Pearl Harbor. Many Americans believe that Japanese Americans were spies for the Japanese government. But even in the face of such oppression, we will see that over 30,000 Japanese Americans are going to offer up their services within the U.S. military. However, they're going to be forced into racially segregated units, and they will only be able to see fighting over in Europe, because the fear was that they would ultimately defect over to the Japanese if they were to fight against them. However, it's important for us to understand that these Japanese American citizens, they were in many cases naturalized, living in the United States for generations, and they were just as outraged over Pearl Harbor as any American was at this point. But it won't be until the 1980s before we see that the U.S. government would formally apologize for these internment camps. And it will leave a very bitter legacy that we'll see associated with the Roosevelt administration. Other groups that would be greatly impacted would include Chinese Americans. They wouldn't be forced into these internment camps, but we will see that the war would bring about an end to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. And lastly, Native Americans would be greatly impacted by this war and actually will become household. In many cases, we'll see some units as well as some individuals who will become household names, namely Ira Hayes, who would be one of the flag raisers at Iwo Jima, as well as the Navajo Code Talkers, who would become famous after the conflict. But as we see all this change beginning to occur to American society back at home, let's now turn our attention to the war effort. How is America going to win this conflict, especially as we see the U.S. fighting a war on two fronts? Now, for the sake of simplicity, for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to focus on first the war that's occurring over in Europe, see how America is going to defeat the Nazis, and then we'll shift our focus over to the war in the Pacific to see how America will ultimately win that conflict. But first, let's see how America is going to fight against the Nazis. Now, when the war begins for the United States in December of 1941, even though they were attacked by the Japanese, what we'll see is that Roosevelt's going to establish a Europe First policy, to where the majority of American supplies, men, as well as other munitions for the war effort would go to Europe. He will be dedicated to defeating Hitler, as him as well as Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, see Hitler as a more immediate issue. However, even though America enters the war in December of 1941, it will be some time before we start to see American troops begin to arrive on the ground over in the European theater. And it won't be until later on in 1942 when we start to see the first Americans arrive over in the European theater through an operation known as Operation Torch. Now, through Operation Torch, what we'll see is that American forces are not going to first land in Europe, but rather in North Africa. The reason for this was because, remember, after France had been occupied, we do see that all the fighting on mainland Europe, unless it's occurring over in Russia, we'll see that Great Britain isn't going to fight there. But rather it has shifted over to North Africa, as Hitler was looking to gain control of oil fields that we see out in the Middle East, as well as the Suez Canal. Now, the fighting had been back and forth between the British as well as the German forces there for the better course of the previous year, but when the Americans arrive in late 1942, this shifts the scales in the favor of the Allies. And as a result, this was the first major victory for the Western Allied powers. Now, before I do move forward, I do want to mention one other thing. I hadn't talked about it earlier, but in June of 1941, we'll see that the Allied powers would also gain another major ally. The Soviet Union would be invaded by Germany, and as a result, they would take the side of the Allies. And we'll see that they would be fighting back against Germany over in Russia, and we'll pick back up with them a little bit later on. But in the meantime, as the Russians were fighting Germany out in the east, there had been a lot of pressure applied to the Allied powers to open up another front a second front within Europe. The first opportunity where we'd see the Western Allied powers open up another front against Germany and Europe would be in the Sicily/Italy campaigns, to where by the summer of 1943 we'd see that American as well as British forces would invade the island of Sicily and then attack Italy itself. And this campaign would carry on to the end of the war. However, even though when cities like Rome were liberated on June 4th, 1944, we'll see that this campaign, this area, isn't going to be highly publicized by the American press. And the reason I'm making this point is because many of the units that would ultimately serve here, at least for the American Army, are going to be very racially diverse. This is where the Buffalo Soldiers are going to fight, all black units. We'll also see that those all Japanese units I talked about earlier, they would also fight here. And the Italian theater would become one of the most racially diverse theaters that we'd see during the course of the war. But it would remain open until the end of the conflict. But by the middle of 1943, the Italian people were beginning to struggle to overthrow Benito Mussolini as a result of basically being invaded. But anyways, with that said, the reason Italy isn't going to receive a lot of press is also going to be because by June of 1944, we'd see another major front would be open in Europe, this time in France. Now, ever since France had fallen, we'd see that the Allied powers were looking for a way to get back into France, to reoccupy, to get France back into the war. And how are they going to do this? Well, by June of 1944, we'd see the Allied powers would begin what are called the D-Day landings. This is where they would assemble almost 200,000 troops for the initial landings, as well as millions upon millions of tons of supplies to retake France. D-Day would occur on the Normandy beaches in northern France, and while there had been high casualties that were suffered by the Allied forces on June 6, we'll see that they would ultimately capture those beachheads, and slowly they would begin to push deeper and deeper into France. And finally, by August of 1944, to make a long story short, Paris would be liberated, the French would be back into the conflict, and we'll see that the Allied powers in the West were on the verge of entering Germany. In the meantime, out in the East, the Soviets finally had pushed back Germany from the face of Moscow, and they too were about to enter Germany as well. And Germany, by the time we get to the end of 1944, was entering its death struggle. To desperately try to hold on to what he hoped to be his 1,000-year Reich, Hitler is going to launch one last desperate attack against the Allied powers in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. We would see at one point it looked like this conflict could be, or this battle could be, a Nazi victory. However, after determined Allied resistance by both the American as well as British forces, we will see that Hitler's attack would end in a failure, and as we begin 1945, the Allied forces from both sides of Germany slowly begin to enter Germany. But as they enter deeper into German-occupied territory, it will be here that they would begin to witness some of those, some of the semblance of what Hitler called his final solution, or better known to us, the Holocaust. Now, to briefly sidetrack and talk about the history of the Holocaust, I want to turn our attention back to pre-war Nazi Germany. As we had talked about in the previous video, Hitler had begun in 1935 to begin to pass a series of laws known as the Nuremberg Race Laws, to where he began to target the Jewish population, strip them of not only their rights, but basically their humanities. And by 1939, we then start to see that he was ready to take it a step further. We'll see that he would look for the systematic murder of all the Jews that fell in his realms. As a result, we'll see that millions of Jews would be sent off to concentration camps as well as death camps to be systematically exterminated. For those who would work in the labor camps, what we'd see is they'd be nearly worked to death, and as a result, we'll see that they would also be very malnourished. For those who went out to the death camps, they were going to facilities that were established solely for the purpose of exterminating them. Thousands of individuals at one singular moment would be wiped out through the gas chambers that we see at facilities like Chermo, as well as the facilities at Auschwitz and many others. And in the end, over 6 million Jews are going to be killed as a result of the Holocaust. Now, I do want to point out that they're not going to be the only individuals who would be killed in the Holocaust. We see other groups that Hitler deemed undesirable would also be killed. Groups like gypsies, Poles, homosexuals, communists, as well as other groups that he deemed undesirable would also be targeted. And in the end, the Holocaust would claim some 14 million individuals' lives. And as both the American and the British armies in the West, as well as the Russian army in the East, begin to discover these camps, they would be outraged by the atrocities that had occurred by the Third Reich. And in the case of the Western powers, we'd see that many soldiers would begin to take on basically revenge vendettas, executing any camp guards that they could find. And we will see that this would play a great role, especially when we get into the years after the war, when the Allied powers wanted to ensure that the Nazis took responsibility for this. And we'll talk about that with the Nuremberg trials a little bit later on. But as we do see the Americans as well as their allies begin to discover these camps, Germany was on the verge of collapse. They were slowly being sandwiched in by both powers from both sides of Germany, and by April of 1945, their collapse was almost complete. The Western powers under Great Britain and the United States and France would meet the Eastern powers on the Elbe River, and I should say the Eastern powers out of the Soviet Union. And on April 20th, 1945, the Soviet Union would effectively surround Berlin, and in a little over a week and a half, we will see that Berlin would fall, Hitler would commit suicide, and shortly after that, Germany would effectively surrender and exit World War II. But with the collapse of Nazi Germany, though, there was a major question. What would Europe look like moving forward? Who should come to control politics within Europe? Should it be made safe for democracy as the Western powers, Great Britain and the U.S. were promoting, or should communism reign out in the Eastern European countries as Joseph Stalin and the Soviets were promoting? Now, to address this issue, we'll see that the powers would agree to meet before the end of the war at the Yalta Conference to discuss this very issue, to discuss what the post-war world will look like. But we will see at this conference and continuing, even though the powers of Europe were allowed, or the nations of Europe were allowed to determine what kind of government they would have, we will see that tensions would begin to rise between these powers that would dominate what their decisions will be. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the Cold War a little bit later on. But even though Germany has surrendered in May of 1945, World War II wasn't over, because there was still another conflict being fought in another region of the world. That of the conflict that we see developing out in the Pacific. And so now, let's shift our focus to the war that was occurring in Europe, to the war in the Pacific, and see how these conflicts are going to be drastically different. Now, shifting our focus over to the war in the Pacific, I just wanted to briefly talk about how the war in the Pacific, the United States is going to fight an entirely different enemy. One that would prove to be much more fanatical than what we'd see over with the Nazis in Europe. Now, the Japanese, what we'll see is that they're going to be greatly impacted by what's called the Code of Bushido. Death before dishonor, basically, to where they would not look to surrender, and ultimately they would fight to the bitter end, to the death. And as a result, many of the battles we'll talk about, there will be very few Japanese prisoners who will be taken. On top of that, we'd find out that the Japanese would prove to be a much more brutal enemy than the Nazis had been over in Europe. Mainly because through their belief system and through being raised in what historians have dubbed a culture of cruelty, where there was massive, harsh discipline like beatings that were often implemented against not only Japanese soldiers but also those living in Japan, we will see that they would view Americans, if they were to surrender, as dishonorable, and in many cases they would be extremely abused, with atrocities being committed. And it was because of those very reasons to why the Japanese, as they're fighting in a very brutal fashion, that American soldiers are going to match brutality with brutality. And it'll be to no surprise that many American soldiers are going to refuse to take prisoners themselves because of what was happening with the Japanese. But anyways, so now that we understand the nature of this fighting, and I'll provide a video on online for y'all to watch to kind of go deeper into this issue, let's talk about the war that was occurring out in the Pacific. How are the Americans going to ultimately win this conflict? Well, the last time we talked about the war in the Pacific, we see that the Japanese shocked the U.S. by bombing Pearl Harbor. However, around that time, that wasn't the only thing the Japanese were doing. We'd see that the Japanese would strike at the variety of allied possessions that we see throughout the Pacific. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Wake Island, Singapore, Burma, several other regions that we see throughout either Southeast Asia or throughout the Pacific would be attacked by the Japanese and occupied in many cases. And Japan, by the time we get to the summer of 1942, had constructed one of the largest empires, territorial empires that we've seen in history. However, by the summer of 1942, all of that momentum the Japanese had was beginning to slow. The American economy was beginning to mobilize. Americans were not stopping down from this conflict. And ultimately, we'd see that the might of the American war machine would slowly grind the Japanese war effort down. Now, by the summer of 1942, we'll see that the American forces, the U.S. fleet, had recovered and won an indecisive victory at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then next won a decisive victory at the Battle of Midway, turning the tide of the war. And from here, we'd see that America would then go on the offensive, first capturing the island of Guadalcanal to prevent perhaps U.S. supplies being threatened that were arriving in Australia. But after the capture of Guadalcanal by the end of 1942, as we enter a new year, American military thinkers understood that they were going to be on the offensive for the remainder of the war, especially as the Japanese were beginning to take a defensive strategy. And so the question was, how could they eventually arrive to Japan? One option was to go through a land-based route, which was promoted by Douglas MacArthur to recapture the Philippines, the very set of islands he had lost at the beginning of the war. And the other major idea would be to go on what's called an island hopping campaign, to take the small, little, remote Pacific islands that the Japanese had occupied during the course of their advance, take them back and slowly inch their way to Japan. Now, both policies are going to adopt it, but we're going to mainly focus on the island hopping campaign. Now, the U.S. forces that would gain a lot of fame during these campaigns would be the U.S. Marine Corps, and they would fight at a number of battles like Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, as well as Okinawa. But in each one of these battles, while they will gain significant victories over Japanese forces and slowly inch their way closer to Japan, they are going to suffer relatively high casualties because they were fighting an enemy that was not willing to surrender. On top of that, we'd see that they would match brutality with brutality, as prisoners on either side would be ill-treated. And it's to no surprise that places like Tarawa, when you see over 5,000 Japanese defenders, only 20 of them are going to surrender. And we'll see that this characterized battles throughout the Pacific for the remainder of the war. But slowly, one by one, these islands would be captured. And by the end of 1945, America was on the doorsteps to entering Japan itself. But there was a major issue. With this very fanatical enemy, that was determined to die rather than surrender, American military thinkers were beginning to question, should they invade Japan? One, because they knew it could perhaps result in upwards of over 1 million American deaths, something that could be unfathomable for the American public. And two, what would happen to the people of Japan? We had seen, and something I hadn't really mentioned a moment ago, but at some of these islands there were Japanese civilians who refused to surrender, who would commit suicide rather than falling into American hands. And the question was, what are they going to do? Are we going to see an entire nation commit suicide rather than surrender? And so this brings up a big question, and a very controversial question. How can the U.S. avoid this? And this is where we'll see, by the summer of 1945, the presidential administration, now the Truman administration, would begin to consider the use of atomic or nuclear weapons to bring about an end to the Pacific War. Now, just to kind of catch up with events, by April of 1945, after winning a fourth presidential term in the election of 1944, Franklin Roosevelt, whose health was beginning to fail, will die in office. He'll die before the surrender of Nazi Germany, and taking over for him would be that of Harry S. Truman, who we'll become very familiar with when we talk about the Cold War next week. But anyways, with Harry S. Truman, when he ascends to the presidency, what we'll see is he's going to inherit a situation to where he has to end the war, as well as bring America out of that conflict, a very difficult task. And while Nazi Germany was assured that they would be defeated in the coming days, he has to deal with that other enemy, Japan, out in the Pacific. And for all those reasons I mentioned a moment ago, he begins to weigh what he should do to bring the Japanese to surrender. And in the meantime, he also has another major issue he has to address. As he goes off to the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, he also has to worry about perhaps a very aggressive Soviet enemy that he could see in the years after the war. And this is where he's going to turn to the use of atomic weapons to bring about an end to World War II, but also to ensure that the Soviets would not aggressively expand at the end of the conflict. Now, what had a result over the previous years is, in response to the Germans perhaps developing their own atomic bomb, we'll see that America establishes the Manhattan Project, to where they would look to develop their own atomic weapon, one that could virtually destroy a city with one singular bomb. And as a result of the efforts of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which if you've seen the film Oppenheimer, which came out recently, great film, but anyways, it basically demonstrates the process of developing those atomic bombs. We'll see by July of 1945, as the Potsdam Conference was occurring, we will see that the first atomic test had taken place and was successfully detonated. And from here, now that Truman understood the power of this weapon, he would threaten the Russians that he now has an all-powerful weapon, that they should not aggressively expand the war, and to demonstrate this authority and to bring Japan out of the conflict, in August of 1945, he would authorize the dropping of the atomic bombs. He would first issue a warning for Japan to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. However, the Japanese would refuse. And on August 6, 1945, the world would never be the same as the world enters the atomic age. We'd see the first atomic bomb would be dropped on Hiroshima, followed by another atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. And why are those two cities the ones that would be attacked with these atomic bombs? Well, it was because they had been relatively untouched as a result of the bombing campaigns of Japan throughout the war. And so once the war came to a conclusion, the U.S. could identify the effects of these two bombs. But anyways, when they were bombed, we'd see that in an instance, and in the case of Hiroshima, over 70,000 people would be instantly killed. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of others who would be impacted by either losing their homes or by radiation poisoning. And even though the bomb wouldn't hit its target at Nagasaki, it would similarly level a city. And it sent a powerful message both to the Japanese as well as the Russians. The Japanese on August 14th would formally reach out to the U.S. agreeing to surrender, and by September they would effectively end World War II. And Russia now realized that Truman was willing to use these weapons in combat. And that will impact the early years of the Cold War, but we'll see that a little bit later on. But with the atomic bombs, now that Japan has effectively surrendered, World War II was at an end. And the question is, what does peace mean? Well, moving forward for peace, we'll see that the world, while it will be jubilant, while it will celebrate the downfall of fascism as well as the Japanese Empire, it's important for us to recognize that this celebration won't last long. Because those former allies, the United States and Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, they will come to clash with one another when we get to the years after the war. And perhaps the world could be on the verge of a third world war in the days after World War II. But we'll talk about that with the Cold War when we meet back in class on the next video. But anyways, with that said, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up here. Just like always, make sure you complete all outstanding assignments, watch all lecture videos, as well as read the textbook chapter. But anyways, in the meantime, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.